With the outcome of the election, a lot of um, time in the effort during the election revolved around the idea of dealing with our immigration crisis. So the question is mass deportation possible and is it moral? So our immigration laws evolved as the world evolved. And it has kind of be broken into three parts because immigration was viewed differently depending on how it was happening. We had the Atlantic crossings, Pacific crossings, and the southern border, and they all have slightly different histories. Okay, so with the Atlantic crossing, prior to the feds getting involved, immigration was seen as a state issue. It was up to the states to decide how they were going to deal with incoming immigrants. In the early 1800s, immigration control was pretty much limited to four main ports of entry: Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and New Orleans. City officials would show up to look over people debarking for signs of illness and for known fugitives. By 1855 to the 1890 time period, New York, being the prime port of entry, opened up something called the Castle Garden. It's a bit of a precursor to Ellis Island. It processed and recorded entrants, and it denied entry to people with chronic health issues. In 1882, a head tax was enacted, which could be paid by bond by another party. However, inability to pay barred entry. Disease lists were expanded. Different forms of criminal acts were added to it, as well as being anarchists or communists, people who'd be denied entry. In 1885, the prohibition of foreign laborers under contract was put into place. Uh, American companies often refused to pay prevailing wages to Americans who were in country, and they brought in cheap labor from abroad that were bound to work until a set time period had been passed, thus, contract labor. Uh, by prohibiting this, it altered what type of people were showing up. By 1890, the Ellis Island system had popped up, which is the one we're most used to seeing. When people were identified for deportation, deported people were sent back with the shipping company of origin at the expense of the shipping company. The idea was that the shipping company knew what the requirements were to be an immigrant, and thus they pre screened people coming through, making the amount of people deported actually not very great. So basically, by putting part of the onus on the shipping companies, it assisted the screening on our end of things. By 1954, the McCarran-Walter Act set up a quota system based on the existing nationalities present in the U.S. The quota was based on 1/6 of 1% of the number of the existing population of a particular group. Or, for example, if they would look at Germans, how many were there in the last census, and then they'd apply the 1/6 of 1% rule, and that's the amount of Germans that could, the maximum amount of Germans that could enter for that year. There were some exceptions made for family reunification and critical skills. 1965, we saw the Kennedy reform, where we added the lottery system, which introduced a rapid program of altering the U.S. ethnic makeup. Now, the Pacific, very different. Now, initially, the numbers were very small. Um, Pre-US Hawaii did get significant numbers because as the sugar plantations came up, they needed workers, and they started making deals with primarily Japan and to a lesser extent China to bring workers in there. However, as Hawaii got drawn further and further into our orbit, this would become a source of Asian immigration over the Pacific to the continental United States. Immigration from China and Japan began to climb as the railroads were being built. The U.S. railroad companies, unwilling to pay the prevailing wages in country, sent recruiters to Hawaii, Japan, and China to bring in workers. Often, so essentially headhunters, they would get paid a fee for each person they brought over. These were contract laborers generally. They were required to work a certain amount of years for the company, in this case, mostly the railroads. And generally, there was a payback stipulation where they'd have to pay the cost of passage back to their employer. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented Chinese from immigrating or being naturalized. This actually was a 10-year act, but it would be renewed numerous times until eventually the 65 Act would overturn all of this. Now, the southern border is a place where we probably are going to spend the most time because where the issues are now. Initially, border crossing was pretty minimal in the early 1800s as the cultures between Anglo Saxon America and Latin Mexico was considered too large to divide. It was an okay place to cross the border to visit for things, but wasn't considered a really good place to live. Now, this would start changing. We would start seeing this a little bit when the construction of the railroads, but we'd see it even greater in the 1890s, where the numbers crossing the border would increase dramatically. Mexicans came for jobs in the mines, the fields, and the factories. However, what was going on in this time period was known as circular migration. Typically, Mexicans would come up, work the jobs, make a lot of money, and then basically go home, bring that money back to their families. And they might do this several times during their lifetime. They might only do it once. We'd see greater numbers pop up during the 1910 to 1920 revolution. This is the time period of Pancho Villa, and this is when the first border patrols were established. During World War II, a mass labor deal was made between the US and Mexico, allowing millions of workers to fill the gaps in the US labor force. In the 1950s, this agreement was terminated with what was called Operation Wetback, and we'll circle back to that. From that point, border crossings on the southern border were essentially a function of what party had control. Initially, Democrats were heavily aligned with unions and opposed cheap labor. And the GOP tended to champion cheap labor on behalf of the industries. And essentially, whoever had the most throw weight in government had the most ability to slightly change the laws in their favor. This would continue this way probably about till from after World War II up until about 1998. Both sides deliberately built the system to be very complex, and this complex system was most likely designed to be porous. In 1998, the Democrats began backing away from labor and unions and siding with cheap labor for corporations. In 2008, we began seeing the championing of open borders. Part of this came to globalist demands, the idea of diluting the nationalism within a country. It's also a function of demographic issues where the native population is not growing as fast as it needs to continue to support the large outlays for uh, government programs for older people. Large corporation pushes for cheap laborers and electorate issues that were brewing, whereas essentially Democratic Party was beginning to see an issue where the they thought the demographics were always going to be in their favor. They were beginning to see that this was no longer the case. So part of it was to try to alter this. In 2016, Trump ends up pushing back on this idea. Uh, and then 2020, Biden essentially opens the borders. So is deportation moral? Now, if you'll notice this little picture here, Canadian flags in the background, Canada, who basically is looked at as some kind of model to a lot of people on the left in this country, does deport people. Now, the idea that it's not moral to deport people is essentially recent propaganda. Deportations happened at pace throughout our history with pretty much nobody noticing. In fact, few cared about it until it started happening, until Trump, because Trump was making noises against it. Of course, the most ironic thing being is the pictures of children in cages, which turned out to be the children in cages under Obama's administration. The point of the matter is every single country in the world deports people. Uh, what makes it moral or immoral, as we look at it, is it truly ethnically targeted? Now, some people say, well, it's the southern border, so therefore it's ethnically targeted. But the thing is it's not just Mexicans crossing the border. It's people in Central America, Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe. People from all over are crossing that border. Is the country, and this is another question of morality, if the country isn't using it to enrich itself, I believe it's moral. I mean, uh, you're not like seizing their assets as you're shoving them across the border. Morally, a nation has a right to assert what it wants to be and stand up to extranational and exterior nationalist desires. There's nothing that says that a country has to follow the whims of organizations and governments outside its borders. So this leads to the question, can this actually be done? Well, I mentioned Operation Wetback before, which occurred in the 50s under the Eisenhower administration. Operation Wetback ended up deporting 1.5 million undocumented Mexicans back to Mexico. So the point is, deportations of this size have happened before. I would suggest with modern technology, it would probably be even a lot easier to do now than it was back then. So if they're capable of finding 1.5 million people to move out, the idea of them being able to do more now seems logical. Now, part of this entailed cooperation with the Mexican government, which is something to take in mind. In order for this to work, the United States is going to have to negotiate with multiple countries to come up with a way of making this work. So, how do you do this? Well, part of it's psychology. The biggest problems occurred is when President Biden said, hey, everybody who wants to come, come. They did. They took him at his word. Now, Trump is a boogeyman to immigration. Even by not saying much at all or doing much at all, he's going to have the impact of people going, maybe the cost is going to be too high to do this. At the very least, we should sit back to see what's going to happen. Trump has picked Tom Homan as Border Czar. Gentleman in the picture here, he's rather legendary for his diligence at doing the immigration deportation job. This is going to have the same effect. He too is a boogeyman. People will reevaluate the cost of coming merely on hearing who he is. I presume that they will begin listing the prime targets of who the deportation will be. It's like, for instance, they might say people have committed certain types of crimes uh, in addition to the illegality of crossing the border. They might add other groups that they consider to be high priority. They make say we're going after this group first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever. By listing who the targets will be, we're probably going to start seeing these people self-deport. If they would rather not get mixed up with the system, they will choose to head home if they can. Another thing that would help is shutting down government aid to illegal aliens. This would discourage people from from staying. Some people would be incapable of staying without aid. Another thing would be legally targeting localities that refuse to cooperate. Essentially, if cities, counties, and states basically say, well, we're not going to play along with this, there is recourse to use the Justice Department to sue these entities to come in line. One of the things that also could be used is legally targeting and shutting down government funding lines to NGOs that are in opposition to deportation goals. A lot of this illegal immigration would be impossible without the NGOs actually helping these people along. They're taking incredibly dangerous journeys, and the NGOs are basically coming in, coaching them on our legal system, giving them extra money, giving them extra food and water, giving them intelligence onto the best place to cross, intelligence as to the movement of immigration services. So by shutting down, either by, because unfortunately a lot of these NGOs are actually indirectly funded by the US government. Uh, Cutting those funding lines would knock the wind out of them a lot, and targeting these via the Justice Department could also complicate their ability to do things. Uh, if they're fighting in court, their money can't be used to assist bringing people into the country. Another option is fining businesses hiring illegal immigrants. Now, this could be done not as a fine people who are hiring all illegal immigrants. They could do it as who's classed for deportation. If you're hiring illegal immigrants who also have criminal records beyond their uh, illegal crossing, that might be something where you might get businesses to look into helping the U.S. government classify uh, the different groups in order to say, okay, well, if we get rid of these guys who are members of the gangs in South America, or whatever it is that's targeted first, they might say, okay, well, if we get rid of these, we'll get left alone for a certain amount of time to continue running the way we need to. They could also shut down overseas wire transfers for individuals who've not positively identified themselves as legal. Essentially, anything that looks like being a suspicious transfer just gets held, and they just say, "Hey, whoever sent this needs to come identify themselves." If they don't show up, uh, you probably have some indication of where this person is and how to basically get towards them. If they do show up, you could basically give them some kind of carrot on this, where, like, okay, you get a longer term stay where we're you may be up on the list, but since you showed up and made this easier for us, you get moved down to the bottom of the list, or maybe even you get some kind of faster track to legal entry, assuming you're not somebody we don't want in here at all, like criminals. Intercept and identify international mail through the U.S. postal system destined to trouble spots. If it turns out people are moving money, these are my things that we might consider putting on hold as well. You don't have to open the envelopes. Some of that can be detected pretty much through the envelopes, through the system the post office already has. And you can just say, hey, this person here, you need to come here and sign to basically release this envelope to continue sending it on to whatever country it needs to go to. Same thing as the wire transfers. Uh, could set up for people who need to be deported, could set up for people who, like I said, give them the carrot approach where, uh, you give them a get out of jail free card for a while or maybe indefinitely. Now, you can also use the carrot approach to people who volunteer to self deport. When you announce your initial list of these are the type of people who we're sending out of the country, well, what's a carrot approach? Well, at a certain point, you're going to have more and more people to deal with. And if we look at, like, for instance, something like Operation Wetback, they ended up using a lot of trucks, buses, cargo ships, and other things like that. Well, maybe if you step to the front of the line and say, "Hey, I'm one of the people you want out," give them a plane ticket and just let everyone know, yeah, the next group of people are going to be in the Greyhound buses, crowded and stinky, and the next group of people, these are going to end up in the uh, in the cargo ships and other things that aren't going to have the amenities. So this may very well, I'll get them to come forward. And also, maybe some of these people are the people you've held up their wire transfers for. You could basically say, okay, if you come up and volunteer to self deport, we will free up your wire transfer and send it on to whoever you have back home where you want it to go. And there are stick approaches. Those who don't volunteer might receive additionally harsher penalties. Substandard transport home. Instead of a quick trip over the border, a long trip on a cargo ship through the Caribbean. Another possibility is something known as deep deportation. I don't know if it's used now, but it was certainly used in the past. Uh, People who were like repeat offenders and other things like that, instead of taking them to an easy central location, you'd basically load them on a ship and take them to the farthest point in their home country you could. So it'd be a horrible inconvenience to them, making them think twice about doing that again. You could also impose longer processing times. If you're waiting longer and longer and longer to get into the process, i.e., waiting for officials to come get you, well, instead of like making 24, 48 hours to get out the door, maybe it's going to take multiple days, weeks, maybe even months before you can get processed through. And that doesn't necessarily have to be from a dickhead perspective. It could be, look, people, as more and more people show up, it's going to take longer and longer to process you. People who get here first are just clearly going to get out of here first. That's all there is to it. Um, there could also be, and I was talking about the classification with the carrot and stick approaches as well, where there may be several different classification groups of who they want in what order out. It may not actually go down the entire list, but if people show up and self identify for classification, um, some of the things could be is deliberately delayed processing. We're going to send you to the end of the list. Don't bother. We're going to grab you and haul you out next week. Okay, it's going to take 7 years to do this. So, yep, you're at the bottom of the list. There could be lotteries where they say, okay, yeah, if everyone who self identifies, so we know where you are and what you're doing, um, we're going to have green card lotteries or whatever it takes to make it worthwhile to do so. They will very clearly try to reset up the stay in Mexico policy. And this may require setting up joint holding centers on the other side of the border where the Mexican government and the US government works together to set up something that's humane and functional. Now, all these ideas I just threw out here as terms of deportation, these methods I don't necessarily agree with. I'm just pointing out is there's people saying, well, there's just no way people could be deported in large numbers. It's impossible. Well, no, that's not true. I mean, this is just a spitball I did in the last 20 minutes. If I spent a couple of days thinking this over, I could probably come up with a lot more. So the idea it just can't be done is ridiculous. And ultimately, it's going to require a complete revamping of our immigration system. Because ultimately, we're going to need to figure out how many people we need in this country, who they are, what they do, and all that other kind of stuff. And I don't see how the government does that in a way that functions. And unfortunately, the free market doesn't give us good solutions, at least not with an open border. There may be solutions available once the border is somewhat more controlled. And I don't see that the border will ever be totally sealed, but it is possible to bring it to a state that's significantly different than the one there is now. All right. So, in the comment section below, what do you think of these ideas coming up in terms of mass deportation, or against? Why? You see huge issues with some of the ideas I threw out here? Do you have ideas of your own? Things that might be things in the tool belt of the government to use for this mass deportation that would occur? Smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please take a look at my other titles. I get into a lot of different things. I almost guarantee you'll find something you like. Consider subscribing. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.